Why do you think so many people stay stuck in destructive patterns for years?
Because the mental health industry ignores the elephant in the room, which is that self deception is actually the root cause of all mental health conditions. And if people don't learn how to accurately see those blind spots with the right structure, they can't see their way out of confirming that bias. So people will feel completely wholeheartedly justified every step of the way until they're getting smacked in the face with the pain and then put up their hands and be like, why would I do this? So you have to get to that root of the self deceptive message.
Give me an example of what self-deception would look like.
There's positive and negative self deception. So I'll give you an example. My brain pattern type skews toward positive self deception. Positive self deception is when your brain will highlight the perception of what reward could wait for you. And it will then start to, in turn, minimize the risks. So a person like me naturally would start to minimize maybe some red flags in someone's behavior, maybe start to subtly justify them, like, oh, everybody's human. Like maybe they'll turn it around. It's going to be okay. Meanwhile, all of my other friends who may have a brain pattern type who skew more negative self deception, where the opposite is true, highlighting the risks, minimizing the reward, would be like, don't you see this behavior? What about this? You can't trust this person. So, on both sides, we're not really operating an objective truth is really the clarity that everyone should gain here. So for somebody like me, I'm going to highlight the reward of, maybe I can get through to this person, maybe I can save this person, right? A lot of people with my brain pattern type tend to have more of that like savior complex, where we're going to let maybe people that don't have good intentions too close to us while still holding out hope that maybe we can get them to change, right? And I know that you have a background with addiction, right? Is that correct? Did I make that up? Yeah. So if anyone has ever been in a relationship with someone who struggled with addiction, typically in a partnership dynamic where one person is not struggling with addiction and the other person is, this dynamic seems to unfold pretty consistently, where one person is like, dedicated to trying to save their partner, all the while maybe having a complete self deceptive message actually causing them to enable their partner in some ways. Have you ever run into that with partnerships when you were going through that?
No, I've never dated anybody who or been in a relationship with anybody who was an addict. I mean, I've been in situations with friends or people that I've coached that have been addicts and I've wanted to help them or coach them or think that I could change them and I don't know if it's the savior complex or the fact I think the tough part too is that I genuinely cared about that person and I wanted the best for them and that showed up in me doing whatever I could to help that person. And I think that it's probably hard for people to separate. Like, how do you stop wanting to help someone that you care so much about?
So herein lies the issue. I totally agree with you that many people who do kind of have what would maybe more classically be described as the savior complex, it's coming from a real, genuine desire to help others, right? It's not fake, it's not performative. What ends up happening by way of childhood patterning is that typically your self preservation instinct lowers, and instead your brain believes, to be safe and to be whole, I have to help take care of other people. So even if that means putting myself at risk or in harm's way, I need to do for others instead of be self centered and do for myself. But what can happen by way of this positive self deception is, because you're willing to do anything, what tends to happen, in particular with addiction, is that there may be subtle things that you're doing where you're maybe over giving, you're softening, you're being too available, all of which could actually to some extent be enabling the very addictive behavior that you're trying to help the person unwind. So sometimes if somebody's brain pattern type skews toward positive self-deception, they always believe they can help. They always believe that they'll somehow figure it out, right? Somehow there's always going to be enough time. They're always going to figure it out at the last second. And to be honest, being in that brain pattern cluster myself, we often do. But you often do at the expense of something, right? There always has to be something that you're borrowing from. Maybe it's your self care, your personal time, your boundaries. Maybe you want so badly to pour into other people that maybe if there's five primary people in your life and you're overgiving to 2 of them, 3 of them suddenly feel like you've abandoned them. And then, it's because you only have so much to give. So what ends up happening is that our brain skews this kind of positive way, and we end up creating pain and destruction as a byproduct of potentially overgiving, placating, softening, and maybe minimizing truly how harmful some people's behavior is toward us or even just around us. But the opposite can also be true with negative self deception. So when we're thinking about messages like negative self deception, some people immediately assume the worst about people. Some people immediately assume ill intent. They're scanning body language, and instead of that decreased self preservation instinct, the opposite is true once we go over to the right side brain pattern spectrum clusters. Instead of caring about what others need to keep everybody safe, it's a very self-centered perspective. So the key, if let's say, the way I always like to look at things is when we're looking out at our world, we're really looking at pixels everywhere. So if anyone's ever seen a pixelated picture where, or even like a magic eye where you get in closer and closer and then all of a sudden you're starting to see other shapes, our world is far less dense and concrete than we believe it is. And what is more likely happening is that we're looking at pixels out in our world, and because of the rules that we've learned as children, we're starting to group those together in very specific definitions. So a good example of this would be you and I could walk into a meeting. Let's say that you and I were business partners and we were looking to bring on a third investor. It's totally possible that you and I could walk into the same meeting, both be in the room for 1 hour with this person, and we leave, and you and I had a completely different experience of that person, right? You could think that they were the best thing ever, and I could leave thinking that they were the worst thing ever. You could be a solid yes, and I could be a hard no. What's objectively true? That's where this all gets very tricky, because depending on how your brain pattern actually skews or distorts how you perceive reality, you're going to kind of squeeze all these pixels into one definition. I could squeeze them into another. What you could see as maybe confident and assertive, if I were a right side brain spectrum person, I could see as boastful, conceited, egotistical. And it really just depends on the lens and how we're interpreting things. And those are some of those granular pieces where self-deception really it determines a whole lot about how we perceive our world, how we label our world, and what we make that mean about us. So an example for you, just based on our previous conversation years ago that I remember, and even just what you had shared with me about how you tend to approach, coaching containers and things like that, you're most likely on the left side of the brain pattern spectrum. I'll send you a brain pattern mapping link and I'll tell you for sure. So if you end up on the left side of the brain pattern spectrum, you tend to have a very high level of situational awareness. And there tends to be, increasingly so as you move out to the left, less care about what others think about you. So you may care for the purposes of maybe like finances, if it's going to pose a risk to your business, okay, you'll take it into consideration. But typically people on the left don't fixate on what others think and feel about them. It would feel unproductive, somewhat like a waste of time, where it's like, yeah, I care more about my career, my purpose, kind of being able to do right by other people. But then when you go to the right side of the brain pattern spectrum, the opposite things are true. Situational awareness starts to decrease as you move to the right. And in its place, people start to fixate on relational inputs. So this could be a reason why I gave you that hypothetical scenario. You and I could walk into that meeting. You're like, oh yeah, they're great. They're confident. They're assertive. But if I'm on the right side of the brain pattern spectrum, and to some extent, I'm skewing everything negatively and I'm making everything somehow about me, I could leave with a completely wildly different interpretation. So this is where, when we start to break down the different unique patterns of self-deception, it's important for us to realize that they roughly break down into 5 buckets. There's, out of 8 billion people in the world, there's really only 5 brain pattern types. And these essentially function like an operating system on your phone, right? So like one person would have one operating system, another person would have another. And how these operating systems function, it's going to determine how you perceive reality, how reality then in turn starts to cascade how your emotions are going to unfold over time. And all of that's then going to spill into patterns of behavior.
I would love to talk about self-sabotage because You talked about self-deception. You gave the example of the person trying to change the addict. And even though they want to help them and they love them, they care about them, what they're doing may be this disconnect from what's actually working to help that person. On the opposite side, that's also true. When somebody is addicted to drugs, they know that they shouldn't be doing these things. They are unhappy with themselves. They're miserable, all the things, and yet they still continue to behave in a manner that isn't reflective of where they want to go in life. And part of that I know is the brain's been hijacked and stuff, but there's still some disconnect going on there. How can people stop self-sabotaging? Like, how can people stop messing their lives up and making decisions that aren't in line with where they actually want to go?
So there's a very specific process. With brain pattern mapping, we track 9 distinct markers, and I typically refer to this as the neurocognitive funnel because one level is going to inform the next level and the next level. So, specifically, and we work with addiction very successfully among other self sabotage behaviors, you have to get clarity on the distinct pattern of behavior, which actually happens at the very bottom of the funnel. So the top 2 markers that we look at determine how you perceive reality, right? So those are going to be the first 2. Those then inform how your body responds biochemically in a 3-part cycle. Then you have a 4-part behavior cycle. And the 4-part behavior cycle is going to track your early stage, transitional, and late stage behavior. The key to solving addiction is that you cannot treat, let's say that we have, person A that struggles with opiate use disorder and person B that also struggles with opiate use disorder. For all intents and purposes, if we just looked at their clinical records, they may look like they do exactly the same thing, right? But if we put those same A and B clients through brain pattern mapping, what we would actually start to find out is that while on paper, these 2 people with opiate use disorder look the exact same, the way that their brain perceives reality and then cascades these behaviors in a pattern is going to be completely wildly different. So what determines the pattern of use ultimately starts from that top of the funnel. What are these small but subtle distortions that are going to occur from the very moment that they open their eyes and how they're essentially starting to piece together the formula? So example would be in the 4-part behavior cycle, some people actually are driven to use in a state of fear, while others may actually be driven to use from a state of anger. Some people are driven to use from anxiety. So we have to understand at what point the brain decides from this emotional state is when I call my dealer, or from which emotional state am I actually already lighting up something to smoke heroin, right? Most of what ends up happening in the addiction space is, and I think there are a lot of people that are trying to unwind this. So I do realize what I'm about to say is a, decent generalization, but in general, just kind of this blanket abstinence of kind of pulling people away from society to, get sober for a period. That seems to be what is generally done. What we have found to be incredibly successful is helping people understand the really subtle nuance shifts that help a person understand, how do my thoughts very specifically shift when I transition from fear to anxiety and then from anxiety to anger, and know the exact moment that I'm going to start to justify doing something that will then eventually lead me to justify calling my dealer. So essentially this is like reverse engineering the process. So let's say we can see all of the dominoes laid out and we get all of the very subtle nuance shifts in the details about how thoughts start to shift, the language of excuse and justification that starts to set us up. We have to find the right entry point that's early, long before we ever start to consider justifying calling the dealer, and put in all of the behavior strategy right there so that we start to prevent all of the subtle shifts that would eventually get us to justify calling the dealer. But what ends up typically happening in most recovery spaces is you're trying to give people like willpower based strategies to not call their dealer. And you're so far removed from the actual thought process and perception of reality that actually was going to get the person there eventually. So we just have to find that right entry point. And the same is true for self-sabotage. The entry point is everything.
And so, what are some guardrails you could put in place for someone, specifically like something like addiction, that could help them not call their dealer or make the wrong move in that place? Like, what are some action items you'd have them do?
So here's an example. We call this in break method the ACB pathway. So once you assume that something is true, your brain is going to go from an assumption stage to a conclusion phase. And as soon as you start to feel conclusive in what you've assumed, it's your brain is actually going to limit certain choices from you in that moment. So when people say, I don't know why I did it, in the, let's say in a context of a parent, where maybe like a parent is mad at a teen who's done something risky and they're just like, I don't know what I was thinking. When we're thinking, oftentimes our assumptions are going to actually start to hide possibilities from us. So when someone says, I don't know why I did that, sometimes that's really true. They really may have no conscious awareness of why they did something that they did. Which is why I think to some extent childhood can be so hard, because parents are often like, stop lying, you know why you did it. And it's like, sometimes people really don't. They don't know. They're not in touch with their underlying motivations, and they can't see what they can't see. And I do think that this is a byproduct of that ACB pathway. So let's say a good example of this would be the ACB in action, because I think it helps to understand how it functions so that we can then turn it on its head for this specific addiction example. So when I was a little kid, my mom had a really bad drinking problem. And if you have a parent who struggles with addiction, there's subtle little things that you see. Maybe you notice that there's more wine bottles in the garbage can, or someone's teeth are purple, right? There's little things where you don't know for a fact, but you can see little things, and your brain is going to start to close those gaps pretty quickly. So let's say I walk into my kitchen and I can smell that there's extra wine bottles in the garbage can, because you can smell that kind of, just the wine smell coming from something. And maybe in that moment I had a really bad day at school, and there's a part of me that wishes I could just run to my mom and say, I had such a bad day at school, and like want to get love and attention. But if I'm a little kid that had the life that I had, and I come in and I see my mom, but I smell that smell of wine, it's highly likely that my brain is going to hide the possibility from me that I can run to my mom and ask her for her loving maternal guidance. And instead, my brain is going to tell me, oh, mom smells like alcohol. Make up an excuse and go back up to your room. Deal with it by yourself. So technically, in any moment, we have so many choices that we're blissfully unaware of. In that moment, let's say my mom was drunk, I still technically could have gone up to her and rolled the dice and been like, hey, mom, I had this really bad day at school today. But because of that ACB pathway in action, my brain in that moment wouldn't have even perceived that choice to run up to my mom and try to give her a hug. It would be like, turn around and go save yourself. Now, to contrast this, my mom was obsessed with Christmas, and I don't know why, but Christmas would be the only season every year where she was somewhat in a decent mood. And going on the same sort of sensory thread, she would boil this like apple cinnamon spice house potpourri stuff. Okay. So let's say, same exact scenario. I just have come off the bus from school. I've had a bad day. I walk into the kitchen, and instead of smelling wine, I now smell this sort of like Christmas potpourri. Immediately, my brain's going to smell that. Assumption, smells like Christmas. Conclusion, mom's happy during Christmas. And now all of a sudden, because I've decided mom's happy during Christmas, running to my mom and telling her about my day is magically available. What's really different? The only thing that's different are literally two different sensory inputs and really nothing else. Is it making sense the way I'm describing it?
Yeah.
Okay. So when we think about something like that, it doesn't take much for our brain to start to close the aperture on what we perceive are our choices. And that is one of the things that we focus on the most in Break Method, is helping understand what language and what sort of logic branches are closing or restricting the choices that we perceive in that moment. So let's if we're trying to get somebody to not call their dealer, the reality is that in most cases, calling that dealer, let's say we've mapped out that there's 10 uniquely identified steps that this person takes on the way to calling the dealer. If we understand what things this client does at step 2 and 3 that may actually start to put them into a state of shame, or maybe they call out sick to work, or they fixate on headaches, or they're ruminating, and then their ruminating leads them to call out sick to work, and then the shame of not going to work makes them feel this sense of futility. Nothing matters. I'm never going to break out of this cycle. Boom, I'm going to call my dealer. right? So instead of addressing the behavior strategy at the time I'm calling my dealer, what do we have to do? We have to get to the root cause of maybe this whole thing is happening because they actually need to learn how to stop their rumination so that they can actually have strategy to work through how to not hyperfixate on physical symptoms like I have a migraine, I can't go to work today, right? Then you get them strategy to actually show up at work and maybe use their voice to communicate with their boss at work so that instead of feeling they have to hide and compartmentalize, there's now this openness and communication where they're starting to build trust with their boss. Do you see where I'm going with this? Where really putting the strategy at calling the dealer is a total waste of time. And I think that is where recovery medicine has wildly dropped the ball. We have to get so much further forward in the cycle than that to actually stop that from ever being a possibility. Because technically they're justifying reaching for that because of all of these other things. And if you resolve the other things, that would no longer make sense.
So I guess what I'm hearing you say is it's like more about like how do we rewire the subconscious mind, because the subconscious is like it's like there's layers beneath these decisions and habits that we're making. Like how can like somebody effectively begin to like rewire those subconscious pathways so they can stop like making decisions like this that would wreck their future?
Yeah, and figure out the true source because there really are real root causes of things that can be ascertained. And with brain pattern mapping, we get to those root causes in 20 minutes. So I think for most people that have been through narrative based talk therapy, you could be talking around your issue in circles for 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years. With brain pattern mapping in 20 minutes, we can isolate exactly where the problems are. And we already know once the brain pattern mapping is done, where exactly you fall on the brain pattern spectrum and what specific patterns of self-deception are going to be distorting your reality. And with that, how it's distorting your underlying motivations. Example would be if somebody already from their childhood pattern skews toward feeling like life is futile and there's no point. And every time, for example, that I try to control my destiny, everything turns on me. So what's the point in trying at all? If that kind of underlying system has been there since childhood, you better believe that at this point, they're also doing things to ensure futility, right? And now they're subtly or even very consciously aware of what they're doing because they need to kind of perpetuate this cycle of chaos so they can continue to feel that like life is futile. I think this is why for some people who struggle with addiction that would have more of that futility pattern driving the behavior, this is why things like AA and NA do work because it pushes you into a highly controlled container that essentially mimics what should I think come in a way that is more balanced than AANA personally. It forces you into a very rigid control structure as a way to prove that you can actually get out of your own way and there is a bigger purpose in life. So I think for that reason, AA and NA does really work for that cluster of people dealing with addiction use disorder. But there are also so many people with addiction use disorder that don't fit into that cluster at all. And those are the people that have extremely high relapse rates, even with something like AANA, because you're not getting to the right root.
I think it's tough for people if you're like heavily addicted to drugs and your brain has been completely like hijacked and taken over. From my experience, it's just really tough to get someone to make a rational decision until they put that drug completely down. Like what are your thoughts on having somebody like put whatever it is down that's wrecking them at the moment, whether it's a drug, whether it's a toxic relationship, whether it's their shopping addiction, whatever it is, like getting rid of that first, getting some sort of baseline, and then working backwards from there into going through their thoughts, reprogramming their mind, looking maybe at some patterns that have, kept up with them from childhood. Like, do you think that there's also merit to that approach as well?
I think there can be, but more commonly, let's use the example of somebody going to a lockdown 30-day facility. And this happened to my mom multiple times, and I've seen it time and time again. When you put somebody who's struggling with addiction use disorder into a 30-day lockdown facility, they will be sober for 30 days, right? They're not allowed to leave. They can't call anybody. They can't go out. They're not actually exposed to the triggers in their environment. in essence, when you're trying to treat a client in that environment, everything is hypothetical. And because they're not actively being exposed to things that are real triggers in their environment, you're going to be hard pressed for work that you do in that environment to actually translate well when they leave. And I think this is why so many people, certainly my mom historically, as soon as she leaves, and then all of a sudden she is exposed to all of her triggers again, she never actually learned how to stay sober surrounded by her triggers, or to choose sobriety when she actually has a choice to go buy alcohol. So for a lot of people, you're going to get more sustainable results. And I'm not saying that this is absolutely true for everybody, but for many people, if you can actually do the work to learn how to be surrounded by your triggering environment and heal in spite of that, you're going to have more sustainable results than trying to pull somebody away from the environment, work on it hypothetically, and then be like, good luck. And that is why I think relapse rates are so high. But one other thing I want to touch on was you brought up kind of the toxic relationship thing. Interestingly enough, what I have found to be true almost every time, and I have high client volume, so we've had over 15,000 clients. In most cases where somebody would be coming to you with some sort of toxic relationship and they are highly convinced it's the other person, more often than not, what ends up happening is that they realize all the things that they're doing themselves that contribute to the toxic relationship. And typically it's a little bit on both sides. Most toxic relationships are not truly one-sided. That's extremely rare. Our method is always, unless there's obviously physical violence, right? If somebody's physical life is at risk, obviously that's a non-starter. But in most cases in my work, we encourage people no sudden movements while you're in break, because we need to kind of have an environment that's relatively consistent to the environment that's previously been causing the problem, so that we teach you how to engage in your real-time environment with better results. But I want to emphasize, one of the key features of break is that we're not at all relying on willpower to do the heavy lifting. It's really important for us to remember that, just like if you were to think about a video game, there's computer code that goes into generating how a character moves around the game, right? We too have code that generates how we move around our own game. And what ends up happening is that many times we're not consciously aware of the code itself. So it's kind of subtly bypassing any of these alarm systems. And again, because of self-deception, we're feeling really justified and rational all the way up until smacking our face or causing problems in a relationship, losing a job, etc. So what we do in Break Method is we actually reverse engineer that code, which are the systems of language that your brain actually uses and generates as a way to actually generate behavior. And instead of relying on willpower, which would be like, don't you see that this is a bad decision? You should do this instead. Because remember, we're way too far down the line. We actually have to prove the error in our brain's systematic thinking at a very early stage, so that the brain can actually start to open up that aperture and we start to actually naturally see possibilities that we didn't see before. Not from force, not because we're trying to do better using our awareness, but there's a very specific process of actually dismantling those language structures. But you have to understand first what the brain pattern is specifically. So like I said, there's those 5 groupings. They break onto something called the brain pattern spectrum. And there are points within the brain pattern spectrum. So there would be like a cluster of one pattern where you could be maybe 4 clicks in or 7 clicks in on that cluster. Once we know specifically where you are, we know the self-deceptive patterns. We know the underlying motivations that drive your behavior, even if you are blissfully unaware. And once we then can start to pick away at those underlying motivations and actually start to show you linguistically what's really happening, most people find naturally they're doing things differently than they ever were before. And when you do things differently, you end up with different outcomes. A good way to visualize this would be, most people, if you're thinking about a toxic relationship where you've got 2 partners, if you guys are in a ping pong game, what ends up happening in relationships is that you develop these ruts of assumption and conclusion and behavior, right? Like, I assume this about the way you just said that to me, so now I'm going to do this, and I'm just going to like keep trying to ace the ball. If both sides are always hitting in a similar pattern, right? If person A is always hitting to the right side of the table, I'm always going to have to hit on the left side of the table. And there's all these other opportunities that I technically have that I'm never being given because of the way someone's hitting the ball to me. So when we actually help people start to subtly shift the way that they're doing things and the way that they're fundamentally seeing situations, all of a sudden we have people hitting in all different places on the table. And then people that they're in relationships with, be it friendship, family members, employees, all of a sudden are now responding to them different because they've been given different inputs. So what ends up happening as a byproduct is their life just opens up so quickly, and they're starting to now get this incoming evidence that actually goes against everything they previously believed was true, which is exactly what we want, because the brain pattern wants to keep proving this negative outcome over and over again. And we need to show it that, unfortunately, it's a brain pattern driven self-fulfilling prophecy.
Speaking of self-deception and toxic relationships, I think one of the things that can limit people in life is like remaining in the comfort zone. And I think people can become addicted to the comfort zone. When you're comfortable, I think you run a risk of, getting in things like toxic relationships because you settle and you think you don't deserve more, or you can say the same thing about things in your career or breaking free from addiction, like all these things. Like, how can people break out of that self-deception where there's so much more potential for what they can bring into the world, but yet they're limiting themselves, based on these thoughts they're telling themselves?
So on the brain pattern spectrum, and I'll make sure I give you a snapshot of this, there's actually a circle in the very center, right? So you've got kind of an XY axis, there's an equal left and right side. There's a circle dead center that I call the circle of complacency, and this is where all of those people are. And it is a byproduct of early childhood inputs where comfort and a certain level of the familiar, knowing what to expect, is what their brain prioritizes most. So in terms of underlying motivation, their underlying motivation is they just don't really like change. And even if what they're experiencing is toxic, that is better than the unknown of what else could come next, right? So they choose the familiar over anything else. So in the circle of complacency, people have virtually no risk tolerance, which is ironic because some people, like you said, they can, from the outside looking in, you're like, what do you mean you don't like risk? Like, you're in a terrible toxic relationship. But to them, again, the risk of the unknown, even if the familiar is painful, that's the scary thing. So what's interesting is that when we work with clients in Break Method, really our job is to figure out where you are on the spectrum and give you really specific rewiring strategy to try to get you more toward the middle. Because people on the outsides, whether it's left or right, you're going to have a variety of negative outcomes. So example would be, the further you go on the left-hand side, people do tend to typically have great careers and become workaholics, but typically intimate relationships can be a source of tension and stress and not as fulfilling as career and purpose, right? You tend to be a little bit more of a lone wolf the further you go out to the left side. The opposite is true if you go all the way out to the far right side, where then we start to see these patterns of dependency, people that kind of have arrested development, never leave the house, still live off their parents, just like can't seem to turn the engine over and kind of become walking chaos. When you look at how to help these people oppose their patterns, really, you're trying to get all of them to a sense of like peace and a balance of knowing when to take risk and when to actually allow there to be peace and stability. Example would be people on the left can typically live in very high stress, wildly changing environments. And because they enjoy risk, they thrive here, right? Like the majority of entrepreneurs are situated in the middle left of the spectrum, because they like change. In fact, when things are too consistent, that's usually when some of their self-sabotage patterns can rear their ugly head, right? Because they're like, I need a little instability here so I can get my creative juices flowing. Then on the right-hand side, these people need to actually learn how to manage their relationships enough and start to prioritize their sense of purpose and see who they really are in the world without this distortion projection lens. So by way of getting these, helping these people with their pattern opposition, you're teaching them how to like be at peace and instability, but also still learn how to take risk. The interesting thing for the people who come to me who are in the circle of complacency is these people need completely different pattern opposition strategy, right? These people actually need to learn how to wildly mix things up, because they tend to, Again, like I said, not take risk, therefore not really have a lot of reward either, right? There's a very specific relationship entanglement with risk and reward. And if you're not willing to take risk, usually your life ends up pretty boring and repetitive without a lot of changes. So a lot of those people, then the pattern opposition becomes, where are we missing opportunities for you to go do something wild and out of character? Where are we missing opportunities for you to go maybe learn new skills? Because typically people here, they're really struggling with not having a very secure identity. Their identity is typically wrapped up in whatever their sense of duty or responsibility is. You see a lot of cultural overlap here with the circle of complacency as well. So example would be like, Indian culture has a lot of people that kind of naturally end up on the circle of complacency on the right hand side, because culturally there's this, honor and respect your elders, your sense of duty and responsibility comes kind of before your personal desires and what you want to do. So when you have people that are in the circle like that, you actually have to help them kind of wildly oppose some of those things, like maybe even be slightly more self-centered, go do something that is out of character and maybe puts them in a position of being a beginner where they're going to naturally suck at something in the beginning. Because people like that, another way of living out that circle of complacency could be just not ever wanting to be bad at anything, but then also simultaneously not being that good at anything either. Not realizing that those of us who have kind of achieved greatness in certain areas, we've had to fall flat on our face so many times and just kind of like brush off the shoulders instead of be like, I'm a complete and utter failure. Like I lost $1 million in 2 weeks once. I was able to bounce back from that and be like, well, I need to make $4 million now so I can pay off this debt. Like I better get to work. But for people that are in the center, that sort of risk to reward ratio tolerance would be so skewed. So you've got to then, the strategy there starts to become why their brain is constantly putting their roles and responsibilities above trying to figure out their own self-expression and teaching them how to take very calculated, specific risk so that they can figure out who they are and realize that even if some people get mad at them along the way, for that person, their life will get better and their sense of identity will get more secure as they learn how to, maybe push against the grain just a little bit more. And for what it's worth, in my practice, typically when I have clients that come to me in that circle of complacency, it only happens to some of my older clients when they are either empty nesters for the first time, or I have some people where they're having some sort of major career crisis at 55 and they're like, I've been in this job for 30 years, help me, what do I do? So those are the two most likely scenarios for somebody to find my work in the circle of complacency. Otherwise, again, as evidence of the circle of complacency, they're typically not really seeking out help because they perceive that the mundane complacent is just fine.
I think on the other side of that, I think that people can get addicted to chaos where they just know that they thrive in stressful environments. And I think that there is some effectiveness there. I think that when there's stress and there's some level of chaos, people like their just ability to get stuff done becomes greater because they know that there's like something on the line, and just their nervous system kind of recognizes that. But I also think people who aren't good at chaos, but they somehow just always attract it. It's like they're unaware that they have this addictive pattern going on. So what are some of the signs that someone is subconsciously addicted to chaos?
So there are a couple specific areas on the spectrum that would be what you just described. One of them actually could be what we were previously talking about, where the person has a desire to help and they only try to see the best in people or look at somebody with more of a hopefully skewed lens. That could be one of the ways that you actually let chaos into your life. So this would be a prime example of me in high school. I was sober, didn't do drugs, was always a designated driver, all of that. And caveat, in freshman year, this was not true, but sophomore, junior, senior year, this was true. And pretty much I hung out with the worst of the worst, like gangbangers, drug addicts. I had a whole summer where I had a friend that was on suicide watch and I had to sit on the toilet while she was in the shower to make sure she didn't slit her wrist. So I was just constantly surrounded by nonsense that was so opposite of who I was. But in my mind, I always just saw the best in people. But the reality was my life had actually moved into a place that was relatively peaceful compared to my younger years. And I needed a certain amount of chaos to be able to function. I needed to, that was like my whole purpose, was being the mediator, peacekeeper. And without being surrounded by that environment, it almost was like I didn't know who I was. So I would find subtle ways to justify bringing these people into my world. So essentially, that would be one of those types. So that's, if you look at the center of the spectrum, that's that first chunk to the left. And they tend to have very low self-preservation instinct, and instead they tend to do for others in a lot of ways because they believe if others can stay de-escalated, then they can stay safe. So it's not necessarily purely for altruistic reasons. Somehow it ties back to their safety. But there are other patterns too, because there are other ways to attract chaos. Other ways that you can attract chaos would be on the right-hand side of the spectrum. There are people who tend to attract very chaotic relationships more so that they can play out their own sort of deflection, projection, splitting mechanisms in an intimate relationship. So that would be a different type of personality cluster than the previous one. The previous one would kind of, if you looked at it like in an orbit, that singular person is very unlikely to be chaotic, but they are surrounded by chaos all the time. Therefore, their life would look reasonably chaotic, but they themselves are not chaotic. If you look at that same system on the right-hand side, the person inside of the chaos is also, they're in their own chaotic orbit with the chaotic person. So both of those can be true, and those would look very different, but there's something that I call the mirror effect on the spectrum, where basically exactly where you are on the left, if you go that same distance on the right, there's going to be shared attributes and ways that that person shows up in the world just based on that mirror effect. So that would be an example there. But that person on the right-hand side, they would be in their own orbit of chaos simultaneous to that. And one thing that I want to earmark here is you mentioned about some people create a lot of chaos so that they basically build up pressure so that they can get things done. So a great example of this from a break method lens would be, just because you can doesn't mean you should. And right, like, and I'm like that. I function really well under pressure. For somebody who functions well under pressure, it's important for you to unwind what you're doing to kind of set yourself up to then be under pressure, because the reality is all of those same skill sets and abilities and capabilities all exist in those earlier stages before you procrastinate. So your life ends up having so much more peace and freedom when you can actually learn not to set yourself up for that pressure, because yeah, you're pulling it off, but you're pulling it off basically because of that positive self-deception, right? Like, I'll figure it out later. There's time. That's only going to take me 20 minutes. Meanwhile, it's like a 4-hour task. So another form of positive self-deception would be, I think now the kids these days are calling it time blindness, right? Where it's like you could justify to yourself that that's only going to take you 20 minutes, but the reality is another person would look at that methodically and be like, this is a 4-hour long task, right? So teaching somebody specifically how to do something without the procrastination so that they have more freedom and peace in their life, for an entrepreneur in specific, it's going to give them much more longevity to their career if they can learn how to unwind that. Because of course they're always going to pull it off, but just because they can doesn't mean that they should, and doesn't mean that that's actually in the best interest of their life, and in particular their relationships in the long run, right? Because a lot of times you're borrowing from your relationship bandwidth to pull those things off. Like, sorry, honey, I have to pull an all-nighter. Like, do you have to pull an all-nighter, or did you just not actually do this 5 days ago incrementally? Because that's really the truth, is that there were probably incremental opportunities that your brain brushed off or deprioritized for other things that it tried to trick you into feeling were urgent, because you knew subconsciously, like, oh yeah, I can just pull an all-nighter, even though what if your partner really wanted to spend that time with you? And then it maybe feels like you're letting work be more important than your relationship. That just kind of, it shows a layering effect where it's like, we think that we're justified in one way, but it's likely going to spill into something else later on down the road.
I'd love to get your thoughts on, like, what's like a good no BS approach for someone to silence the negative voice in their head that's constantly like limiting themselves, telling themselves they're not enough to be successful and to do great things.
So I think often what happens in today's world is kind of more of a band-aid or override approach. So let's say the message in your head is like, I'm not enough, I'm unattractive. the kind of modern day answers, affirmations, like, no, girl, you're enough. Like, write all these affirmations on your mirror, do this meditation. The break method approach is very different than that because, again, if you're trying to insert strategy at the time the air quotes bad thing is happening, you're already too far removed from where you had to actually make the change. So essentially, what we have to do is figure out what are the subtle things that you're doing to kind of engage with your world or agitate your world that are leading you to an outcome where you're going to look in the mirror and be like, I'm unattractive, or lead you to do something where you maybe don't do as well as you thought you're going to do, and you're like, I'm a failure, I'm never going to make it, right? It's not usually, and this is the caveat I would put here, is with pure OCD, where people tend to really just kind of like fixate on intrusive thoughts and can't get out of them. So I would treat that one differently. But in most other cases, there's a very specific root cause pattern that you can find to actually start to dismantle those thoughts. So the same architecture is true. We have to determine why your brain made that formula in the first place and get really specifically to the exact moment itself. And this is an important point to make because so many people are convinced about why they are the way they are. And they come into therapy, well, I'm like this because I've got mommy issues, or I'm like this because my dad did XYZ. What I have found to be true almost 100% of the time is that the actual inputs that created the output that you're struggling with are so under the radar and not what you would have thought they would have been, that if you're so convinced that your story's over here, what ends up happening is that it's a distraction, and then you kind of start to build your whole mental health identity and narrative around the story that you've decided on, not realizing that it's actually these under the radar subtle inputs, like, maybe a subtle look that your mom gives you of disapproval and then doesn't say anything, right? It's not necessarily this big crescendo moment. It's the repetitive things that happen every single day when you're little. And people forget that our brain pattern is developed between 2 and 5. And it's hard. A lot of people don't remember their childhoods, which makes certain things more challenging. But with brain pattern mapping, we bypass that because we use historical data points to predict the pattern. So even if somebody doesn't remember things, they can still do brain pattern mapping. At ages 2 to 5, and those that are watching this that are parents, like, it's a wild time. Kids are wild. And even the most emotionally regulated parent is going to have moments of stress and fighting with a partner and making mistakes and being late to school, right? There's just, toddler years are intense. They're very intense. And then if you are in a family that has multiple kids, you've got all these different things where now a new sibling is born. And now, as a child, even if it's not objectively true, you may feel that your parent only loves your sibling now, right? So little messages like that are actually what make us who we are. And a lot of times they're completely irrational, and they're coming from that age specific snapshot in time. We have to get to that snapshot to understand how your brain is actually starting to formulate this negative self-talk, and then see how your brain is actually finding ways to recreate it in its environment right now. So in other words, the best way to stop the negative self-talk is to actually figure out what point actually started it in the first place, and actually start to rewire the language structures that the brain is using to eventually get you to the negative self-talk. And it's not a quick fix. It's not like a do this one thing for 1 minute. But I will say with break method, it isn't in comparison to potentially years of going in and out of programs and talking to your therapist every week. With break method, it's roughly 16 to 20 weeks of intensity, and then you don't ever have to do it again. So I think while it's not a snap your fingers quick fix, it is a reasonably permanent, sustainable fix, because once you actually uproot the system, it's just not going to come back. Obviously, life can still throw you curveballs, and we have clients that maybe will pop in, like, let's say they were really wanting to get into an intimate relationship and they'd been single for years, and now all of a sudden, like, they're getting married and they're like, I want to do a little refresher to make sure that I don't screw this up, right? So sometimes you'll get that sort of client where they'll come back and maybe do a little refresher, or they have a new opportunity and they just want to make sure that they're approaching this new opportunity in a different way. So there's the brush up, but in general, once you do it, the consistent feedback I get from clients is you can't unsee what you see in break. And when you actually learn fundamentally to see your world differently, like at that base level of reality, what you do from that place is naturally different. And I think that is the key of mental health, is that if we don't help shift the way we fundamentally see the world at that level of perception, any other thing that we do is going to be white knuckling and willpower. And when you change the perception, all of a sudden people are like, oh my God, like, wow, I a year ago I would have sworn that person hated me, but now I can see that it would have been a me thing and this person's delightful. So things like that, that's a full on guarantee. Those moments happen probably starting from week 6 on, where you're realizing, oh my God, now that I can see differently, a lot of these other behaviors, they're self-resolving, because it really has to do with what we think we see.
So essentially what you're describing in your program like helps people like erase limiting beliefs in a matter of months and not decades, which I think is amazing. As we're kind of bringing this to a close, I would love to dive into self-confidence, because I think that one of the things that trips people up is that they've had years and years or decades of shame, negative events, all these things going wrong in their life, etc., and they just don't have the confidence to believe in themselves. They don't have the confidence to XYZ, choose a better relationship, whatever the example is. Like, how can somebody fast track their way to building radical self-confidence?
Okay, you ready for this? Confidence issues are actually caused by commitment issues. And this is something that I don't know why it gets so overlooked everywhere, but in all cases of confidence issues, what you actually start to uncover is an underlying commitment issue. If you think about how confidence is generated, I like to use the example of base jumping. Like, let's say you decide, like, I want to feel confident base jumping. You couldn't just watch a bunch of YouTube videos on base jumping and then your head be like, I'm going to be an epic base jumper, and then just stay in that spot where it's like in your mind, you can envision, hypothetically, I'd be a great base jumper, but never actually go base jumping. And I think that's what people that are looking for confidence often do, is they'll watch all these videos like, how do I build confidence? And then they spend all this time maybe reading books or watching YouTube channels, but they're never actually taking action, right? So if we use this sort of example of, I want to get good at base jumping, I have to commit to go grab a base jumping rig at a minimum, right? I've got to like grab a base jumping rig, and then I have to walk to a cliff, and then I have to have the courage to throw myself off the cliff, because I won't know if I'm good at base jumping unless I have the courage to throw myself off the cliff. So I have to commit to actually going to get the base jumping rig, and I have to have courage to jump off the cliff itself. Only then will I land my feet on the ground and be like, holy, I just base jumped. That was awesome. But until I actually execute those steps in that order, it would all be in my head. And when something's in your head, depending on the person you are, you can skew that again positively or negatively. I could never do that. It's not even worth it. Or in your head, maybe you have kind of more of an inflated ego and you're like, I'm going to be so good at that. And maybe you talk about base jumping all the time, and someone in your life finally is like, bro, are you actually going to do it? Right? But then we have these people who maybe commit impulsively, right? They're just passion driven. So they're like, sounds like a bad idea. Let's go give it a try. What's ironic is that typically those people are the ones that come off in the world like they're confident. And it's because they just say, yeah, like, why not? The why not is typically what ends up creating the experience of confidence to somebody on the outside. Example would be, there are girls that look confident when they kind of like objectively are dressed in a disheveled way. Like, and then you have these models who have really low self-confidence. Like, how could that be, that somebody like looks perfect and they feel like they look ugly? And then you have a girl that's like got dreadlocks in her hair from not brushing it, and she, thinks she looks hot AF in her sweatpants and Uggs. And then to a guy, for example, one is going to resonate possibly as more confident, because you're going to see the one person's like, wow, I mean, this girl's just like, the way she's walking, there's just something about her. Meanwhile, the gorgeous model girl that's all up in her head with negative self-talk, maybe she gives off, I don't know, like cuckoo vibes. So big picture here, because I think this is important for people to remember. If you focus on why and how your brain starts to justify not committing to things or delaying things, and you work on kind of meeting that lack of courage in your self-efficacy, you will start to become wildly confident. But confidence is something that's built during childhood or it's not, because it has everything to do with how your parents set up your world. If your parents put you in situations consistently where you have to figure it out on your own and you have to commit and kind of have a little bit of grit and have emotional resilience to figure out how to do something, and they don't jump in and coddle you and enable you and allow you to lean into learned helplessness, then poof, that's the formula. You turn out as a confident adult, for better or for worse. But if your parents help too much, enable you, soften things, you end up not having self-efficacy. And as a byproduct, you tend to kind of break check when you're not really sure and you don't know if there's going to be someone there to help you. And then you don't commit, you're not courageous, and then you're not confident. So that's the cycle. You got to work on the commitment issues first.
Well, and you have to escape the trap of chasing instant gratification and external validation, which builds fake confidence. How do people get out of that rabbit hole?
Well, and then that's the grit and emotional resilience thing, right? Like the people that do actually show up in the world confident, they're going to see something as a setback to keep like doggedly pursuing how to get past it. Whereas the person that doesn't have a high level of self-efficacy and grit, they're going to see that setback as a personal failure and they're going to stop trying. So I think the most important thing to do is to work on however everyone, depending on where they are in the spectrum, going back to that self-deception piece, we're going to label setbacks in different ways. So if you start to understand and maybe start to poke holes in like, am I feeling like this is a personal failure, but maybe there are other people who have found a way around this, maybe I should go look at what other strategies would be to work around this issue instead of just immediately, even though my brain's telling me I've failed, is it possible that maybe there's a solution, right? Even just kind of that first little glimmer of like, is it possible? That curiosity might create just enough of an opening for you to go see if there's a mentor or somebody who's had a similar problem, maybe somebody to kind of, maybe even just give you the swift kick in the pants that maybe your parents should have and be like, buck up, like go try harder. I don't know what the solution is, but I do know you're capable. Now buck up and go get it done, right? Sometimes that strategy, depending on the person, also works where it's like, stop complaining, you got this. So depending on the type of person, it's really finding a moment when you want to label something negative and feel defeated to ask yourself the right questions to maybe expand the possibilities to maybe there's another way, or maybe I can go talk to my confident friend and tell me how they might handle this problem so that I can kind of dig back in and try again.
Well, Bizzie, thank you so much for coming back on the podcast. Always love talking to you. Highly recommend people check out your book, Your Brain is a Filthy Liar, and check out the Break Method. Check out your podcast. Once again, thanks for coming back on. I think my audience is going to love this conversation.
Thank you so much. And yeah, there's a link for brain pattern mapping up at the top of the Break Method website. It's only $22, takes 20 minutes, so definitely worth it. And then my podcast is Decoded, and we're going to have Doug on the show soon, so definitely come check it out.
Awesome. I'm looking forward to our conversation on your show, and thanks again for coming back on the podcast.
Of course. Thanks so much.